You know, it's funny, when we start talking about the really deep history of, well, what's now Indonesia, the name itself feels, well, it feels a bit anachronistic, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, Indonesia is a term that only popped up in the mid-1800s.
Exactly. So today we're going way back, way before that name, to explore the ancient roots of this incredible archipelago.
Yeah, we're leaning heavily on Tim Hannigan's A Brief History of Indonesia. It's quite something how he pulls together such a huge sweep of time.
He really does.
We're talking kingdoms rising and falling, trade, religion, um, even volcanoes shaping things. And he mixes local history with, what outsiders saw when they visited.
Right. And it's definitely not just going to be us listing facts. Think of it as, well, us trying to piece together the foundations of this place. It's the world's fourth biggest country by population now, largest Muslim majority nation.
And so much of that population concentrated on Java, which is relatively small, geographically speaking.
Yeah, it's wild. You really have to picture this vast, kind of scattered chain of islands, the archipelago, as Hannigan puts it. It's this major crossroads, between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, constantly being shaped by geology, too.
Definitely. And the story, well, it really starts deep in prehistory with Java Man.
Ah, yes, the famous discovery along the Solo River.
Right. Evidence of early humanoids. Over a million years ago. It's a key piece in the puzzle of how early humans spread out.
But then there's that other, maybe even more intriguing find, the Flores Hobbit.
Oh, Homo floresiensis. Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting for early seafaring.
How so?
Well, the fact they were on Flores means their ancestors must have crossed the Lombok Strait. That's a serious deep water channel, a major ecological boundary.
The Wallace Line runs through there, doesn't it?
Exactly. Crossing it maybe as far back as 95,000 years ago, maybe even earlier.
Yeah.
That suggests they weren't just accidentally washed ashore. It implies some kind of, capability.
Wow, actual seafaring that early.
It seems like it. Maybe basic rafts, but still, intentional crossing. And they might have survived until, what, maybe 12,000 years ago?
So they could have overlapped with modern humans arriving.
Potentially, yeah. It adds this whole other layer. And you even have those local Flores legends of the Ibu Gogo, these small, hairy people.
Hmm.
Could be a folk memory, perhaps.
Fascinating possibility. It really does make you rethink that whole period. Okay, so after the Hobbits, who are the next major players on the scene?
That would be the Melanesians. They're the first modern humans, Homo sapiens, to reach the archipelago.
And there's still a significant population group today.
Very much so, particularly in the eastern parts of Indonesia.
Huh.
A really deep, continuous presence.
Okay, and then come the Austronesians. Hannigan calls their arrival by sea the perfect point of departure for, well, pretty much everything that follows. Why is their arrival so key?
Well, the Austronesian expansion is it's epic. One of the biggest human migrations ever.
Yeah.
Starting from Taiwan, somehow they developed this incredible maritime culture. And they just spread out across the entire Pacific, all the way to Easter Island, and west, across the Indian Ocean, eventually reaching Madagascar.
Madagascar, that's incredible. They crossed the whole Indian Ocean.
Seems so probably around 1,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
While folks in other places were building cities, these guys were mastering the oceans.
But it wasn't like a sudden invasion, right? Hannigan pushes back against that idea.
Oh, definitely not. No waterborne southern Mongoloid horde, as he puts it. It took thousands of years. It was gradual island hopping, settlement by settlement.
So the people who reached New Zealand as the Maori, their distant ancestors, were connected linguistically and culturally back to Taiwan and presumably places like Java.
Exactly. But over vast stretches of time and space. Within the archipelago itself, it was likely a slow diffusion, probably without any sense of some grand unified migration.
And do we know anything about their early societies here?
We get glimpses. Hannigan points to things like clan houses,
Hmm.
similar in structure, perhaps the ones you could still find in places like Sumba today. Suggests societies organized around lineage, village founders, that sort of thing.
Yeah, okay, so we've got these skilled seafarers spreading out, settling islands. What about trade? Did that start early on?
Oh, yeah. From the get-go, they were using those outrigger canoes for exchange. Initially, probably local stuff within island groups. But over time, those networks stretched further.
Connecting with mainland Asia.
Exactly. That's how new materials, new ideas started flowing in. It really laid the groundwork for the bigger trade patterns later on.
And one significant early example of that cultural exchange involves those bronze drums, right? From the Dongsun culture.
Ah, the kettle drums, yes. Those start showing up middle of the first millennium BCE, give or take, from what's now Vietnam.
And they turn up in places like Java, Bali.
Nusa Tenggara, too.
Mm.
And they were clearly a big deal locally. They became prestige items, symbols of status. Some were even used as coffins and burials.
Wow. So they weren't just importing them, they were really integrating them into their own cultures.
Absolutely. It shows this pattern early on, adopting foreign things, but making them their own. And it wasn't just a one-way street.
How do you mean?
Well, the evidence suggests raw materials, maybe ores, were going from the islands to the mainland. And in return, things like metalworking techniques might have come back.
So a proper network was developing.
Slowly but surely, yeah. An international trade system was taking shape. And the western end of the archipelago was becoming this really crucial waypoint linking China and India.
A maritime staging post. Okay, that makes sense. So this increase in contact naturally leads us to the influence from India, right? And what is called Indianization.
Exactly. And Hannigan gives this great snapshot. A Persian dhow arriving in Sumatra way back in 671 CE to show those long-distance sea links were already there.
But the main cultural shift, the Indianization, that was more gradual.
Yeah, and often driven from the top. You'd have local chiefs or kings who saw advantages, maybe prestige, in adopting Indian religions, court styles, that kind of thing.
And their people would follow.
Often, yeah. It seems to have been largely a top-down process initially.
And a huge part of this was literacy, wasn't it?
Massive. Suddenly you have writing systems arriving Sanskrit for religious texts, Pali maybe too, and local languages start being written down using the Pallava script from South India.
That changes everything. Records, laws.
Administration, religious philosophy. It's a game changer for how societies were organized and how knowledge was passed on.
But Hannigan stresses this wasn't like India just taking over culturally. Local traditions survive.
Oh, absolutely. It was very selective. Rulers picked and chose. They integrated Indian gods with their own local deities and ancestor spirits. The rigid Indian caste system, for instance, never really took root in the same way. It was adaptation, syncretism, not replacement.
And there wasn't just one single Indian religion coming in.
No, there were different ways, different traditions.
Mhm.
Early on, maybe more Brahminical ritual focus. Then you get worship of Vishnu becoming popular, and later Shaivism, devotion to Shiva, became really significant, especially in Java.
And Buddhism, too.
Buddhism as well, yes.
Yeah.
We know from the Chinese pilgrim Yijing, who visited Sumatra in the 7th century, that there were thriving Buddhist centers there. So quite a diverse religious scene.
And this is the era of Srivijaya, right? That powerful kingdom in Sumatra.
Yes, Srivijaya emerges as this major maritime power, dominated trade through the Malacca and Sunda Straits for centuries, really influential.
Based initially near Palembang.
Seems like it, yeah. Though its center later shifted north, towards Malayu, near modern Jambi. And interestingly, by the time the later Muslim sultans ruled Palembang, the actual origins of Srivijaya had become kind of hazy, lost to time.
But its legacy, especially linguistically, that was huge.
Absolutely crucial. South Sumatra, the heartland of Srivijaya, seems to have been the original wellspring, as Hannigan calls it, of the Malay language. Yeah. And because Srivijaya controlled the sea lanes, Malay spread as the language of trade, the lingua franca, all across the coastal areas of the archipelago.
So the ancestor of modern Indonesian and Malaysian.
Directly traceable back to the language spread by Srivijaya's influence. It's an incredible linguistic continuity.
That is incredible. Okay, so Srivijaya dominates the seas from Sumatra. Let's shift focus to Java then, and the rise of the Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms there, leading eventually to Majapahit. Where should we start? Borobudur.
Borobudur is just breathtaking. A massive Buddhist monument built over generations by the Salandra kings, and apparently with no overall blueprint.
Just adding layers and terraces as they went.
Seems that way, which makes you wonder about the workforce. Hannigan raises the question, was it forced labor? Because, while the kings were Buddhist, the deep-rooted beliefs in the surrounding countryside were likely still a mix of Shaivism and older ancestral traditions.
So maybe not a population deeply invested in building a massive Buddhist temple.
It's a possibility. It paints a complex picture. And then you get the next dynasty, the Sanjayas, taking over in central Java, ruling the kingdom of Mataram. And here we see that Hindu-Buddhism concept really flourish.
What exactly was that? A mix?
Kind of a unique Javanese blend. Syncretism is the key word. Mixing Shaivite ideas, maybe some Vaishnavite elements, Mahayana Buddhism, and local spiritual beliefs all together. They even seem to have incorporated Buddha into the Hindu pantheon sometimes.
So not strict divisions between the faiths.
Not really, no, a real integration. But this Sajaya Matram period, with its big temple-building focus in central Java, it didn't last all that long.
Only about 50 years or so. Why did it end?
Well, probably a few factors. The sheer cost and labor involved in building monuments like Prambanan must have been immense, a huge strain.
Right.
But also, a massive eruption of Mount Merapi seems to have devastated the region around that time.
Ah, the volcano.
Yeah,
Always a factor there.
definitely. And that seems to have prompted a shift. Power moves away from central Java, eastward.
To the Brantis River Valley area.
Exactly, near Gunung Penanggungan and the Brantis Delta. And this new location had big advantages.
Like what?
Well, you've got incredibly fertile volcanic soil for agricultural rice bowls, plus easy river access down to the coast for maritime trade.
Ah, combining agricultural wealth with sea access.
Precisely. And strategically, it was well placed, kind of equidistant between the Straits of Malacca, the main gateway to the west, and the Spice Islands Maluku out to the east. Great connectivity.
Makes sense. So this area becomes the new power base, leading eventually to kingdoms like Singasari and then Majapahit,
Yeah.
and then the Mongols show up.
Right. You get Kublai Khan, having conquered China, looking to extend his influence. He sends envoys to Singasari demanding they acknowledge his overlordship.
And King Kurtanagar of Singasari wasn't keen.
Not remotely. The story goes he responded by, well, humiliating the main envoy, Meng Qi, cutting off his nose or branding his face, depending on the account.
Ouch. That's provocative.
Extremely.
Yeah.
You don't do that to an envoy of the Great Khan and expect him to just shrug it off.
So payback was inevitable.
Absolutely. Kublai Khan assembled a massive fleet, thousands of ships, and sent it to Java in 1293 to punish Kurtandara. Though, ironically, Kurtandara was already dead by the time they arrived. But the invasion itself had major unforeseen consequences for who ended up in power.
Right, setting the stage for Majapahit's rise. Okay, another huge transition point, the arrival and spread of Islam. How did that begin?
Well, Hannigan paints this picture of a Bengali merchant ship sailing near the Andamans, a reminder that those sea lanes were busy carrying people and ideas constantly.
So Islam likely arrived initially through trade.
That's the general consensus, yeah. Srivijaya, back in its heyday, was very cosmopolitan. You would have had Muslim merchants and sailors from Persia, Arabia, India, living or trading alongside the Buddhist monks and others.
So a gradual presence long before any rulers converted.
It seems likely. The earliest hard evidence we have, though, is a bit cryptic. It's a cluster of early Muslim gravestones. The oldest one found so far is in East Java, near Kadiri, dated 1082 CE.
1082, that's quite early.
It is. But we don't know much about who these people were. Were they foreign traders who died there? Local converts? It's unclear. But it marks a definite early Muslim footprint.
And then later on, we start seeing actual Muslim rulers establishing themselves.
Yes, by the late 14th and especially the 15th century, things really accelerate. You get powerful Muslim port states emerging. Malacca on the Malay Peninsula becomes hugely important.
The center of trade and Islamic learning.
Exactly, and Brunei in Borneo. And it spreads east too,
Mm.
reaching the Spice Islands, Maluku. Ternate and Tidore become Muslim sultanates.
That's where the Arab traders called it Jazirat al-Muluk, the Islands of Kings.
Precisely. That's the origin of Maluku or Moluccas. So Islam is spreading via these key trading hubs.
And what's happening with the big Hindu-Buddhist kingdom Majapahit during this time? Is it just fading away?
Its political power was definitely waning by the 15th century. But culturally, especially in Java, its influence remained strong for a while. There were still many active temples, priests, scholars, mystics. And it's interesting, Tomé Pires, that Portuguese visitor in the early 1500s, he noted how the new Muslim rulers on the coasts were gaining power over the inland chiefs. But even many Muslims still held the old Hindu-Buddhist mystics and holy men from the interior in a kind of awe or reverence.
So, not a clean break. More overlap and mixing again?
Very much so. A period of transition, coexistence, and probably continued syncretism for a long time.
But eventually Java does become predominantly Muslim. How is that usually explained? The Wali Songo.
Ah, yes, the Wali Songo, the Nine Saints. Tradition credits them with the Islamization of Java, spreading the faith through preaching, teaching, maybe even using things like gamelan music and shadow puppetry.
Are they historical figures?
It's hard to pin down all nine definitively.
Yeah.
Some are likely legendary, embodying the process. But others, like Sunan Gresik, whose real name was probably Malik Ibrahim, seem to be genuine historical figures from the late 14th, early 15th century associated with early mosques and Islamic communities.
So a mix of legend and some historical reality. representing that gradual conversion process.
Exactly. It likely involved Sufi teachers,
Mhm.
traders establishing communities, local rulers converting, centers of learning being set up. A complex process over generations, integrating Islamic beliefs with the existing Javanese culture.
It really brings us back to that theme of the archipelago constantly absorbing and adapting, doesn't it? From those earliest migrations through Indian influences and now Islam.
Absolutely. We've traced this incredible journey early humans, the vast Austronesian expansion, creating linguistic links across oceans, the rise of powerful maritime states like Srivijaya, shaped by Indian ideas.
The amazing temple building in Java, the shift of power, the Mongol intervention, and then the gradual complex arrival and spread of Islam, reshaping things yet again.
And all of this happening in this unique geographical space, this crossroads of islands, fostering trade, movement, and this constant blending of cultures.
It's really striking how these deep historical layers, the language roots, the trade routes, the patterns of religious syncretism, were all being laid down centuries, even millennia, before anyone thought of calling it Indonesia.
Definitely. This whole deep dive just underscores how that constant flow of people, goods, and ideas across the water for thousands of years created this incredibly rich, unique historical tapestry.
And that ability to adopt, adapt, and integrate foreign influences seems to have become almost a defining characteristic of the region from very early on.
It really does. It makes you think, doesn't it? About how that long history of borrowing and blending religious ideas, art forms, language itself forged a distinct identity for this archipelago long, long before the modern nation state existed. That adaptability is perhaps the core story.
A fantastic point to end on, thinking about that constant process of mixing and adaptation as the real foundation. So much more we could explore there, the individual stories, the local variations. But that's a great place to pause.